Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we'll be looking at Jesus speaking and teaching in the temple in the last week of the life of Christ. If we look at the formula and the chronology of that last week in the life of Jesus, we look at Sunday, and I'm a traditionalist when it comes to this sort of thing. Sunday we have the triumphal entry as Jesus comes into the temple. In some accounts, we don't have this differentiation, but it seems that he comes into the temple, looks, sees what's there, and then turns around and leaves. He doesn't cleanse the temple on this particular day. The next day, we have him coming back to Jerusalem from his base of operations in Bethany. This time he curses the fig tree on the way in, and he comes into the temple and he cleanses it, and of course there's a confrontation that ensues. The next day, Tuesday, the fig tree has been withered and Jesus is teaching in the temple. As far as I can tell, the following day, Wednesday, there's no specific mention. Now, some folks want to change this chronology, and that's okay. I'm not going to really argue either way. But as far as I can tell, there's maybe what happened on Tuesday just carries over into Wednesday as well. There's nothing that says it all has to have happened on the same day. Then on Thursday we have the Last Supper, the betrayal of Jesus, late that night, his arrest, actually maybe even early the next morning. So that on Friday, and this is why we call it Good Friday, we have the trials of Jesus very early, late the previous night and early that morning. And then he is crucified and dies upon the cross, and then before sundown his body is taken and buried, so that he is the last part of Friday and then Saturday and Sunday in the tomb. And of course he rises from the dead on Sunday. Saturday would be the Sabbath, and we're told that his body is taken down prior to the Sabbath, and then he rises from the dead on the first day of the week. All right, so that's the sort of the backdrop that we're going to be looking at. Jesus now comes to the temple, and when you come to the temple, the main entrance to the temple was on the south side of the temple structure. You have this big temple mount, and you have these stairs leading from the south. The stairs are still there today, although there's been other structures that are that are built up next to it, and the actual entryways have now been blocked up. But we can look at this model. Now, the model's not entirely accurate. You have these two gates, two on one side and two on the other. Now we know, and we learned this after this model was constructed. They never went back to fix the model, but it was actually two gates on the left and three on the right. These were known as the Huldah gates. You can see three on the right. Today they're blocked up, but you can still see the outline of where the Huldah gates were located, named after the prophetess Huldah from the days of Josiah. She didn't have anything to do with the gates, but they were just named after her, commemorating her. And you would go up through those gates and up the stairs, and that would take you out into the court of the Gentiles. So here from the other side, we see the gates in the distance, coming up from from underneath the colonnade, and that would put you in the court of the Gentiles. And then there was a low wall around the temple complex that led to some other gates, and you had these various courts: the court of the women, and the court of the men, and the court of the priests. And these were all surrounding the actual temple itself, which was the place where only the priests were allowed to go into the temple. Not everybody went into the temple. Only the priests went there, and then only at certain special times. Any priest couldn't just walk into the temple at any time. It had to be the special time of the sacrifice and the lighting of or the putting oil in the lamp stand, or of offering, doing the offerings upon the altar of incense. And then once a year, only the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies. But that wouldn't happen at this time, as Jesus is in Jerusalem at this point. This is for the Passover. And so nobody's going to be going into the Holy of Holies during this period. So Matthew chapter 21, verse 23, when he entered the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him while he was teaching and said, "By what authority are you doing these things?" These things, remember, he had a cleansing of the temple on the previous day, and now he was teaching, and sort of who gave you the right to do all this? By what authority? Who gave you this authority? By what authority are you doing it? Who gave you the authority to accomplish these things? It's going to be a question of authority, and that will be the question that sort of takes up the entire day. Jesus said to them, I will also ask you one thing, which if you tell me, I will also tell you by what authority I do these things. Here's the question that he asks. The baptism of John was from what source? From heaven or from men? And they began reasoning among themselves. Now, they're not reasoning about what the real answer is. They're reasoning as to the politically correct answer. And so they're saying to themselves, if we say from heaven, he's going to say to us, why did you not believe him? If we say from men, we fear the people, for they all regard John as a prophet. They're not concerned with what the real answer is. They're only concerned with what the politically correct answer is. And answering Jesus, they said, we do not know. Now, maybe they didn't. But that's not their motivation. And he also said to them, neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things. Jesus isn't going to give his truth, the truth of his authority, to those that are only interested in a politically correct answer. So here's Jesus in the temple. He is asked this question regarding authority, by what authority? And he replies with a subsequent question about John the Baptist. Where did John the Baptist get his authority? Because really, the answer to that question is the answer to the first question. Jesus got his authority from the same place where John the Baptist got his authority. In both cases, it came from God. And so they're not going to tell, and he's not going to tell. Sort of a don't ask, don't tell, scenario. And then Jesus proceeds to tell some parables dealing with this question of authority. So, first of all, there will be the parable of two sons. Here we go. But what do you think? A man had two sons, and he came to the first and said, son, go to work today in the vineyard. And he answered, I'm not going to go. I will not. Now, here's a son disrespecting his father's authority. But afterward, he regretted it, and he went. Even though he initially acts in disobedience, he thinks better of his disobedience, and he goes and does what he ought to have done in the first place. Verse 30, the man came to the second and said the same thing. And he answered, I will, but he didn't go. He gives the right answer, but the wrong response. And so we have these two contrasting sons. Now the question comes up, which of the two did the will of his father? And of course the answer is obvious. The first one did. Even though the first one gave a bad answer at first, he went and did the will of the father. The second one gave the right answer. Can I say it this way? He gave the right doctrinal response, but he did not do the will of the Father. And Jesus says to them, truly I say to you that the tax collectors and the prostitutes will get into the kingdom of God before you, because even though they had initially given the wrong response, they had repented and turned back to God. And these Jewish leaders who had the right theology but did not follow it up with a action of faith showed that they are not children of the kingdom at all. For John came to you in the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him. But the tax collectors and prostitutes did believe him, and you, seeing this, did not even feel remorse afterwards so as to believe him. You see, they repented, and you haven't. You thought you did not need to repent, and so therefore you are still in your sins. Now, I have parables of authority. First, the parable of two sons. Next is the parable of the vineyard, a second parable regarding authority. In this parable, Jesus says, listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard, and put a wall around it, and dug a winepress in it, and built a tower, and rented it out to the vine growers, and went on a journey. And already you're supposed to say, I remember this parable. Wait a minute, this isn't original to Jesus. He's just merely transplanting. He's telling the story from a previous story that had been told way back in the book of Isaiah. Here it is, Isaiah chapter 5 and verse 1. Let me sing now for my well-beloved, a song of my beloved. This is God singing concerning his vineyard. My well-beloved had a vineyard on a fertile hill. He dug it all around, removed its stones, planted it with the choicest vine. He built a tower in the middle of it. See, all is exactly the way Jesus told it. And also hewed out a wine vat in it. Then he expected it to produce good grapes, but it produced only worthless ones. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, you see, that's who the parable's about. Judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? Why, when I expected it to produce good grapes, did it produce worthless ones? Now that's an Old Testament parable in the book of Isaiah, Isaiah chapter 5. He goes on to say, so now let me tell you what I am going to do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it will be consumed. I will break down its wall, and it will become trampled ground. And that's exactly what eventually took place in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC. The Babylonians came, and its hedge was pulled down, its walls were pulled down, and it became trampled ground. Yes, they eventually came back into the land. They were given another chance. And here they are again. And here again, God is speaking regarding his vineyard. And again, there's a question. Are you going to obey, or will again your walls be torn down, and will you be once again taken into captivity? You see, the rest of the Isaiah passage says, I will lay it waste. It will not be pruned or hoed, but briars and thorns will come up. I will also charge the clouds to rain no rain on it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah his delightful plant. Thus he looked for justice, but behold bloodshed, for righteousness, but behold a cry of distress. And now it's happening again. So, here's the parable the way Jesus tells it again. Listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard, put a wall around it, dug a winepress, built a tower, rented it out to vine growers, and went on a journey. Very much like the Isaiah, but notice now the differences. When the harvest time approached, he sent his slaves to the vine growers to receive his produce. The vine growers took his slaves and beat one and killed another and stoned a third. See how the parable has changed now. Jesus took what started a familiar parable, but now he's adding details to it. Where the vine growers' slaves. Who were the vine growers' slaves? Well, just think of who the prophets were back in the Old Testament. And some were beaten and killed and stoned. Later on, Jesus asked the question, which of the prophets haven't you persecuted? Haven't you tried to put to death? Again, he sent another group of slaves, larger than the first. Another wave of prophets, can we say it that way? And they did the same thing to them. But afterward, he sent his son to them, saying, they will respect my son. First comes the prophets, then more prophets, and finally, ultimately, God sends his own son. But when the vine growers saw the son, they said among themselves, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him and seize his inheritance. They took him and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those vine growers? It's almost a rhetorical question. After all, he had sent slaves, he had sent other slaves, finally he had sent his son, and look what they did to his son! Murdered him in order to take the inheritance. They said to him, he will bring those wretches to a wretched end and will rent out the vineyard to other vine growers who will pay him the proceeds at the proper seasons. And that is exactly what the Lord would do. He would take those who had rejected his son He would pull down their vineyard, bring them to a wretched end, and rent out the vineyard, rent out, can I say it this way? Rent out the kingdom to others who would see him as their Lord and Savior. That is exactly what has taken place throughout history. God has taken the kingdom from those who rejected it and has given it to those who recognize him as their king. Jesus said to them, "Did you never read in the scriptures? The stone which the builders rejected." Now, I have to tell you, this is Psalm chapter 118. This was one of the Psalms of Ascent. This is a psalm they'd been singing as they came to Jerusalem on this particular Passover season. So when he says, "Did you never read? Haven't you been listening to the very song you've been singing? Didn't you ever read it? The stone which the builders rejected, this became the chief cornerstone." This came about from the Lord, and it is marvelous in our eyes. The very song they'd been singing is being fulfilled before their eyes. That he will be rejected, and then he will be built up, and he will be that upon which the entire kingdom, can I say it this way? He will be that upon which the entire church will be founded and will rest. "Therefore I say to you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you." Now Jesus gets personal. It's not just them, it's you. "And given to a people producing the fruit of it. From whom is the kingdom taken? It is taken from those who rejected him." He's speaking right now to the religious leaders of Israel. It's not to say that it's taken away from all of Israelites, because the early church is going to be almost entirely Jewish. But it will be taken from Israel as a nation and given to a people producing the fruit of it. Who will that be? Well, that will be both Jewish believers and eventually that will be Gentile believers too. It's what we call the church. Verse 44, "And he who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, but on whomever it falls it will scatter him like dust." Jesus is standing in a place, the walls of which will be torn down within the space of a single generation. Well, when the chief priests and the Pharisees heard this parable, they understood he was speaking about them. They got it. They understood it. Verse 46, "When they sought to seize him, they feared the people because they considered him to be a prophet." So, we have parable of two sons, a parable of a vineyard, and now a third parable. This is a parable of a wedding feast. In this parable, Jesus spoke to them again in parable, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son." Notice again, I've got a king. Notice again, there is his son that's there. Two commonalities with the previous parable. "And he sent out his slaves to call those," again there's the slaves, "and the slaves are sent out to call those who had been invited to the feast, to the wedding feast, but they were unwilling to come." They'd been invited to a party, and they didn't want to come. Again, he sent out other slaves. Notice again, I've got two sets of slaves. I've got, I guess you could call them the former prophets and the latter prophets. The first set of slaves were sent out, and now a second set of slaves, other slaves are sent out, saying, "Tell those who have been invited, behold, I prepared my dinner, my oxen and my fatted livestock are all butchered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding feast. Come and rejoice." But they paid no attention and went their way, one to his own farm, another to his business, and the rest seized his slaves and mistreated them and killed them. You see the commonality with the previous parable? Verse 7, "But the king was enraged, and he sent his armies and destroyed those murderers and set their city on fire." Jesus is standing in a city that 40 years from this point will be burning. Then he said to his slaves, "The wedding is ready, but go to those who were invited, but those who were invited were not worthy." Now he says, Go therefore to the main highways, and as many as you find there, invite to the wedding feast." The folks that were invited didn't come. They're not worthy. They've been punished. They've been put aside. Now go invite others. And those slaves went out into the streets and gathered together all they found, both evil and good, and the wedding hall was filled with dinner guests. But when the king came in to look over the dinner guests, he saw a man there who was not dressed in wedding clothes. That is, he had come, but there was not a proper preparation. And he said to him, "Friend, how did you come in here without wedding clothes?" Now, tradition often had it where if you were invited to the wedding feast of a king, he would provide the clothes. And the man was speechless. Here the man had not taken which was provided. He had not dressed appropriately. He just wanted to sort of come in there, but not to do what was proper, to have a right way of looking. The man had nothing to say. He was speechless. But the king said to the servants, "Bind him hand and foot, and throw him into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen." You see, to come into the kingdom, you don't, on the one hand, you come as you are, but you don't come and stay the way you are. You come and receive that which the Lord has given. You receive the wedding garment. I love the image, and maybe this is borrowed from that, over in Zechariah chapter 3, where the vision is given of the high priest, and he's standing before the Lord, and Satan's there to accuse him. And what's more, Satan has something about which to accuse him, because he's standing there in dirty garments. And he's the high priest. He's supposed to be in clean, bright, white linen, pure priestly garments, and instead they're dirty. And apparently they're dirtier for a reason. It's a picture of the sins of the people. But the Lord says, take those from him and give him new and clean garments. And the Lord does that here too, for those that turn to him in faith. But if you seek to come to him and just stay the way you are, well, then you're not allowed to remain. Throw him into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So I have 3 parables of authority, and now beginning in chapter 22, verse 15, I have some questions that come up from the critics, and the first of those is going to be a question regarding taxation. So these are questions that are being thrown at Jesus. The Pharisees went up and plotted together how they might trap him in what he said, and that's going to give rise to the questions. So notice the questions are intentionally a trap in which to entrap Jesus. And they sent their disciples to him. Pharisees had their own disciples, along with the Herodians. Now, the Pharisees and the Herodians are strange bedfellows. You have the Pharisees who were separating from all of the sinfulness and more specifically from the paganness of the Gentiles. And then the Herodians are sort of anything about Herod is okay. And, of course, Herod got his authority from Rome, so anything about Rome is okay, too. These folks are on opposite sides of the political spectrum. But they have teamed up against Jesus. They both have decided we don't like Jesus. And they come saying, "Teacher, we do not know," or excuse me, "Teacher, we know that you are truthful and teach the way of God in truth." You think, well, if they knew that, why aren't they following him? They're trying to butter him up. They're trying to give an insincere flattery in order to bring him down. "Teacher, we know that you are truthful and teach the way of God in truth and defer to no one, for you are not partial to any," which they were all of those things. Verse 17, "Tell us then, what do you think? Is it lawful to give a poll tax to Caesar or not?" Now, the poll tax to Caesar was a very unpopular tax. And so they're posing a question that will have a lose-lose situation, sort of like one of those "do you still beat your wife" questions. If he says, yes, it is lawful, then he will be unpopular with the people. If he says, no, it will not, then they are ready to go and accuse him, which they'll try to do later on. They will accuse him of telling people don't pay your taxes to Caesar, and they will accuse him before the Roman authorities. And either way, they think they have boxed him into a corner. But Jesus perceived their malice and said, "Why are you testing me, you hypocrites?" They are hiding behind a mask. That's what a hypocrite is. "Show me the coin used for the poll tax," and they brought him a denarius. And he said to them, whose likeness and inscription is this? Well, the denarius had the inscription and the likeness stamped into it of Caesar. They said to him, Caesar's. Then he said to them, then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. You give Caesar his stuff, and you give God his things. Think about it. Everything belongs to God. But pay your taxes. Do that which is appropriate to Caesar, and then do that which is commanded, that is necessary, that is appropriate to God. And hearing this, they were amazed, and leaving him, they went away. They go to sort of regroup. They call for a timeout. And so next we have a question regarding the resurrection. It will also be a question from a critic. It will also be a trap. On that day, some Sadducees. Now, in case you didn't know about the Sadducees, they say there is no resurrection. The Sadducees pictured themselves, whether they really were or not is a matter of some debate, but they pictured themselves as ultra-Orthodox. I don't know that they really were. But they said, we just believe in the first 5 books of Moses. Genesis through Deuteronomy, that's it. And since those books don't clearly teach on the resurrection, and I agree they don't clearly teach it, and Jesus is going to show in just a moment, the resurrection is there, but it's not obvious yet. It has to be pointed out. And they didn't believe in things like angels, which I'm not sure I get, because there are angels in Genesis and Exodus and so on. But they didn't believe in angels or life after death, and when you're dead, you're dead. That was the position of the Sadducees. So on that day, some Sadducees who say there's no resurrection came to Jesus and questioned him, asking, Teacher, Moses said if a man dies having no children, his brother as next of kin shall marry his wife and raise up children for his brother. That's what was known as the Levirate marriage. And it's true, not only did ancient cultures have it, but the Mosaic Law also had this as an appropriate thing. You know, remember they didn't have Social Security, so this would bear children for the family of the deceased, and this was the way it was to take place. Now here's the hypothetical situation. Now there were 7 brothers with us. Notice when they say with us, they're saying maybe it's not hypothetical. I think it was. I think they were making it up. But in the story, there's 7 brothers, and the first married and died, and having no children, left his wife to his brother, and so also the second and the third down to the 7th. So last of all, the woman died, and there were no children. In the resurrection, therefore, whose wife of the 7 will she be? They see that as an insurmountable problem, for they all had married her. And so they're using this as an attack against the resurrection. Now Jesus answered, and he said to them, you are mistaken, not understanding the Scriptures, nor the power of God. Your question presupposes something where you've missed the whole point. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. In other words, resurrection is a life after death, but it's not just this life after death. It's a different kind of life after death. Yes, it is bodily, but no, it's not just a continuation of today's relationships. It's a different kind of living. In fact, it might be that when you're in the resurrection, you look at your previous life and you say, my goodness, I wasn't really living at all. It's as if though I were asleep. But regarding the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was spoken to you by God? And he's going to quote the Torah. He's going to quote the first 5 books of Moses, where God says to Moses, God says, I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. Now, he didn't say, I was the God of Abraham. He says, I am the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And therefore, if he said to Moses, writing hundreds of years after Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had died, if he says to Moses, I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob, well, he's not the God of the dead, but of the living, which presupposes that Abraham and Isaac and Jacob continued to exist, continued to live even after they died. When the crowds heard this, they were astonished at his teaching. Why? Because he spoke with authority. But when the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered themselves together. Notice the tag teaming that takes place. First we had the Pharisees and the Herodians, and now the Sadducees, and now we're back to the Pharisees. And this time, the question will be regarding, it's still a question from the critics, the question will be regarding what is the greatest command. Here we have one of them, a lawyer. Now that's not a lawyer in today's sense, it's a lawyer in that sense, an expert in the law of Moses, asked him a question, testing him. And here's the question, Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? And he said to him, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and foremost commandment. And even though he hasn't been asked this, he says, the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love God, love your neighbor. Love God, love man. On these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets. After all, you look at all of the commandments, the 10 commandments, as well as the commandments that follow, all the stipulations that follow, and they can all be summed up under one of two headings, either love God. The first 4 of the 10 commandments are all about loving God. If you love God, you're not going to build any images. You're not going to have any other gods that will be over him. You're going to keep his name holy. You're going to keep his day holy. You're going to think of him and remember him. And if you love your neighbor as yourself, you don't have to be told, don't kill him, or don't commit adultery with him, or don't with his wife, or don't steal from him, or don't bear false witness against him, or don't covet his possessions, because you won't do all those things if you really love your neighbor as yourself. So really, these 2 commandments are the 2 headstones of all the other commandments. On these 2 commandments hinge and depend and are founded all the other commandments. Finally, we have Jesus himself. We've had notice the whole section started off with a question of authority, and then we had parables about authority, and then questions from the critics. But now Jesus himself, it's his turn to finally ask a question. Here it is. While the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them a question. What do you think about the Christ? Now remember, the word Christ is the way you say it in Greek is Christ, the way you say it in Hebrew is Messiah. It just means the anointed one. What do you think about the Messiah, the Christ? Whose son is he? And they said to him, well, he's the son of David. Now they're getting that from the Old Testament. The son of David was to be the anointed one, the Messiah, the Christ. And he said to them, then how does David in the Spirit call him Lord, saying, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies beneath your feet. If David then calls him Lord, how is he his son? Now, you have to understand what's going on. He's quoting from Psalm 110, verse 1. That's a psalm of David. And in that psalm, David had been speaking to the Lord, speaking to Yahweh. And the Lord, Yahweh, had said to, not to David, but he had said to David's Lord. Now that's a third person involved. Yahweh, the Lord, said to David's Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies beneath your feet. Now, this brings up a question. David had been the king when this had taken place. And Yahweh, he's the Lord, he's God. But David had a different Lord. David's Lord here is the Messiah. And they understood this is a messianic prophecy, a messianic passage. How can the Messiah, who is David's son, also be described as David's Lord? Because lordship always goes chronologically downhill. That is, you are not the Lord of your parents, rather your father is your Lord, is your master. And so you're the Lord over your son and grandchildren and so on. But David's son is described here as David's Lord. How can that be? Unless David's Lord pre-existed, unless he existed before David. Now he is David's son, so he's born after David, but he lived before David. This is the Messiah. This is Jesus, the one who is, yes, the son of David, but at the same time lived and existed before David was even born. David's son, David's Lord. It's the same person. And no one was able to answer him a word, nor did anyone dare from that day on to ask him another question. That brings an end to all the questioning. The question hinges now upon who is Jesus. How is he both David's son and David's Lord? Well, we had this question from Jesus in Matthew chapter 22. And now as we turn now to chapter 23, we're going to see Jesus, they're all silent, and Jesus is going to pass judgment now upon the scribes and the Pharisees. He will pass judgment on what they do, and then he will say, don't do what they do, but it's okay to do what they say. And then he's going to pronounce a series of woes against them. Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. Therefore, all that they tell you, do. And observe, because they actually had the right theology, they had the right teaching, but do not do according to their deeds, for they say things and do not do them. Don't do what they do, but it's okay to do what they say, because what they said is actually, they've got correct theology, they understand the scriptures, but they have not applied them. They tie up heavy burdens and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move them without so much as a finger. Verse 5, but they do all their deeds to be noticed by men. Remember how Jesus had said, don't do your deeds to be noticed by men. They do their deeds to be noticed by men, for they broaden their phylacteries and lengthen the tassels of their garments. They've got all these religious rigmarole. They love the place of honor at banquets and the chief seats at the synagogues and respectful greetings in the marketplaces and being called rabbi by men. I have to admit, it's nice to be called rabbi. It's nice to be called doctor. It's nice to be called nice terms. Who doesn't like to be called? But we shouldn't be seeking that. But do not be called rabbi, for one is your teacher, and you are all brothers. Do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in heaven. Do not be called leaders, for one is your leader, that is Christ. But the greatest among you shall be your servant. I remember when I was first ordained, and I walked into the church office the next day, and the church secretary says, well, what do we call you now? And I thought about that, and I said, well, how about John? That's my name. It just didn't occur to me to call for some sort of fancy title. But whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, and whoever humbles himself shall be exalted. So, notice the Pharisees, they shut off the kingdom from the people. They devour a widow's house. Now notice I put this in italics, long prayers, because that's not in all the manuscripts. But we'll include it in our chart anyway. In verse 15, they travel over land and sea to make proselytes. In verse 16, they swear by the temple, but they don't want to swear by the gold of the temple, as if one is greater than the other. In other words, they've got all these little loopholes and different ways of saying things to justify themselves. In verse 23, they tithe the mint and the julep. They've got this little mint plant, and it's grown up to be 10 inches, and they'll actually cut off an inch and give it to the Lord. But they neglect justice and mercy and faithfulness. They are so concerned with the intricate details, but they miss the big thing of justice and mercy and faithfulness. Verse 25, they clean the outside of the cup, but inside the real cup, inside themselves, they are full of robbery and self-indulgence. They are like whitewashed tombstones, full of dead men's bones, looking so nice and pretty on the outside, but there's ugliness and deadness inside. That's the picture of these Pharisaical leaders. Finally, he says they have built the tombs of the prophets. Now that's not a good thing. In other words, they killed the prophets. They sought to put them to death. And what we have, if it's true that verse 14 indeed is not in the original text, I can't say for sure either way, then I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I have 7 woes. It sounds a bit familiar. It sounds a bit like what I'm going to see later on in the book of Revelation, with 7 woes that are against these people. Finally, we come to verse 29. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say, if we had been living in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partners with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. But in truth, they're doing exactly the same thing. So you testify against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of the guilt of your fathers. For indeed they are going to do exactly the same thing. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how will you escape the sentence of hell? Therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. That's what had been happening all throughout the Old Testament. But it's not done yet. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, so that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah. That is, from one end of the Old Testament to the other end of the Old Testament, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. From first to last, you have become guilty of all. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. And within a generation, within 40 years, the very place where Jesus is standing would be destroyed by the Romans. The people would be slaughtered, and those that survived carried off into captivity. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who were sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together under the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and yet you were unwilling. Notice that the heart of Jesus is not angry. There is the wrath of the Lord, but oh, he wishes that they would have instead turned to him. He cries over Jerusalem. He weeps over Jerusalem. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. For I say to you, from now on you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.